First off, I lost my voice as I said in last week's video and it's still raspy, so I apologize for that. This will be my 100th YouTube video and I've never had a response like I did to last week's video. There were some strong feelings and they're understandable. Talking about plants can get awfully serious even though they're just plants. But today I hope I can clear up some of that confusion. So settle in and let's talk Borsigiana drama. For those of you that didn't see it, last week I made a video outlining there's different types of albos in my opinion. And then we got a bunch of different comments and opinions whether or not that is actually true. Many people believe that they're all Borsigiana. Many people believe that they are all Deliciosa. Some people believe that there is a mix and there's different forms. So we're going to break that down scientifically and then kind of anecdotally what I think is true based on 15, 16 hours of research I did for this video. So in the 1840s, there was a Danish botanist down in Mexico by the name of Frederick Liebmann. So essentially in the 5,000 to 7,000 foot elevations in Oaxaca, Mexico, this guy finds Monstera deliciosa, describes it, and then publishes it in a journal at the end of the 1840s. If you actually look up Monstera deliciosa on Wikipedia and anywhere else, if it's correctly annotated, it will say Monstera deliciosa and then Liebmann. Then in 1862, a gentleman by the name of Carl Koch, a German botanist, then describes a smaller form variety of Monstera deliciosa. He describes this plant in a scientific journal by the name of Monstera borsigiana, a name you commonly hear these days. In 1908, we finally get the name Monstera deliciosa, VAR standing for variety, Borsigiana. It's very true in science and worth remembering that what's true today might not be very true tomorrow and it might be completely wrong. Okay, now in 1972, we have a gentleman out of Mexico who's actually Japanese begin describing a small type of Deliciosa-like plant that they've been growing in Mexico City. He finds it on the Tacanaensis volcano in Mexico, begins describing it as something that sounds a whole lot like Borsigiana. This plant is called Monstera Tacanaensis. I'm just going to call it Monstera Taken. Matuda states in his research that this plant had been cultivated in Mexico City for a long time and it had been actively crossed and mixed with Monstera deliciosa, large form, for a long time. So what he was describing was an entirely different plant that he found different from Deliciosa and that they were actively mating and crossing in Mexico City. Then in 1977, we have a groundbreaking paper by Michael Madison called A Revision of Monstera, which is heavily sourced even today, where he essentially says there's a huge continuum of plants within Monstera deliciosa that tend to come out in different conditions, and therefore he finds it most useful to just characterize them all under Monstera deliciosa and not other species or different varieties. So now everything back in 1977 is now put back into Monstera deliciosa. So up until this point, 1977, the paper by Michael Madison is what everyone has been using. Technically, the best way to describe these plants and the scientifically legal way to describe them is Monstera deliciosa, even if they're small form or big form. But I don't necessarily agree with that. And in 2020, a groundbreaking paper came out out of the University of Costa Rica. Cedeno Fonseca et al. Produced an incredible piece of research in 2020 and then another revision of Monstera in 2022 that are definitely worth checking out, and we'll go through them now. In the International Aroid Society journal called Aroidiana, they put out a paper which essentially revives the Matuda name from 1972, the Japanese gentleman out in Mexico that said there are different species, and he backs up this research and makes a very strong case that the small form version of Monstera deliciosa that looks, and we've been calling Borsigiana, is actually Monstera Taken or Tacanaensis. This is super exciting. So let's now go through this super interesting piece where he shows the differences between Monstera deliciosa, huge, large form like this, with winged petioles and a bunch of different characteristics, versus small form, which was Borsigiana, but he makes a very good case that some of these smaller form plants are likely Tacanaensis. So this speaks to the video that I made last week or the week before, where I said everything was either Deliciosa or a smaller form, because I have anecdotally found also that there are differences between very large form Deliciosa format plants and my albos that are much smaller typically with less fenestrations. So let's go into the research now. In part A, we have the different thicknesses of the stem and also the internodal spacing. As you can see on the Monstera Deliciosa, it's a really tight, compact node spacing, and it's a super thick stem. I can't show you guys this plant right now, but we're talking like almost like a baseball bat size stem. Whereas the smaller form plant, I always want to call it a Borsigiana, but the Monstera Tacans here is very thin and it has a little bit longer internodal spacing. I don't know if you guys can see this, I'll zoom in, but you can see the winged petiole on this Deliciosa. I've grown the Deliciosa from seed, and I can tell you that once they get big enough, at the bend of the stem, of the leaf stem, is called the petiole, they'll get these winged ribs, and that's what you can see in figure C. You're seeing the difference between Deliciosa gets the winged petioles, whereas Tacans, or the small form Deliciosa-like plant, will never get that part of the petiole to have a winged part. And then in figure E, you even see some varicosum-like bumps along the petiole stem, which I've seen on big form Monstera Deliciosas at maturity. Whereas even through maturity, Monstera Borsigiana or albos that I have in smaller form, they just never get that ribbed-like stem. That's why I've always thought these plants are definitely different species. It's crazy to lump them all together as the same Deliciosa-like plant. And in this comparison chart, you can see the big differences in fenestrations and the number of lobes. That's essentially, this is considered a lobe, and this is another lobe. So on Deliciosa, it can have fenestrations up to 100 different holes in each leaf, and typically has about 4 to 10 lobes per side of the leaf. If you look at a leaf and you split it down the middle per each side, about 4 to 10 on average, whereas Borsigiana is about 2 to 5. I keep saying Borsigiana, I mean Monstera Tacans or Deliciosa-like. Another crucial thing that I've noticed anecdotally is even on my adult albos, my old plants, they never get a flattening of the petiole. So typically a petiole is like very cylindrical on an albo, even on older leaves. These big leaves on the Deliciosa will flatten and then kind of pinch off. It's just another difference, and they outline this in the scientific literature also. And finally, petiole length. The length of the leaf stem that goes down towards the stem on a Monstera Deliciosa is very long. Whereas you look at a small form Monstera Deliciosa like a Tacans, and it's very short in length typically. And that also coincides with the much thinner plant and much generally smaller form looking plant. In this slide about the Deliciosa, you can see the classical massive Deliciosa leaf, and then you can see all those inner fenestrations, which we all, I think, know about at this point. We've seen probably in person or out in the wild even. Whereas this slide on the Monstera Tacans, it just looks like a Borsigiana. It looks like a more spaced node plant, which with a lot less compact internodal spacing. So it's putting off leaves a little bit more distance between them and doesn't stack up exactly like that Deliciosa does. And here are a couple of the Tacanaensis out in the wild, and they just look like small form Borsigianas. They look like small form Deliciosas, even at maturity sizes. So wrapping everything up, I've grown Thai Constellation from tissue culture. Back in 2018, we got the plant, so I've had the plant about 4 years. And here's the photo of it with the other Monstera Deliciosas I was growing in hydroponics at the time. They are all Monstera Deliciosas, clearly by the photo. But then heavily in contrast, I have a bunch of mature albos, Monstera albos, with a Thai Constellation mixed in, and you can clearly see who sticks out like a sore thumb. It's very obvious to me that these are different plants and different species of plants. Deliciosa gets much, much bigger than Tacans or a Borsigiana-like smaller form version of Monstera Deliciosa. I would suggest that these are different species, as the University of Costa Rica has pointed out. And here's a photo of one of our Monstera albos that we bought, and this is a very mature plant. This plant is probably a few years old as that Thai Constellation, and you can see it just remains small and stout. Even with 7 or 8 leaves on it, it just never gets that big. And if you look at most of the albos, they tend to have that between 2 and 5 different lobes along the leaf, and doesn't ever have 100 different fenestrations through the leaves, and never gets those massive Ticon leaves that we've all seen. So to wrap this up, the only scientifically accurate way to describe these plants are either Monstera Tacanaensis or Monstera Deliciosa. But when it comes to horticulturalists and kind of Instagram and YouTube and things of that nature, we're not necessarily going to go by the scientific literature. I mean, many people still call Monstera Deliciosa a split leaf philodendron or breadfruit or many other different common names. So technically it's not correct to say Monstera Borsigiana, and I was incorrect on that. It's not correct to say Monstera Deliciosa variety Borsigiana either. We know what you're talking about, but technically speaking and scientifically speaking, I hope this video helps clear it up for people. It is technically Monstera Tacanaensis or Monstera Deliciosa at this point, but we'll see what tomorrow brings. I reached out to a few authors of the paper without comment yet, but I'll be sure to get back to you guys if I hear something from them. And I did reach out to Mick Mittermeier without any response yet, but I will keep you guys posted. So please forgive me if I continue to call the small form Deliciosa-like plant a Borsigiana. Technically I should call it a Tacans, but I don't know if that's going to catch on. Or Tacanaensis. I don't know if that's going to catch on Instagram or the internet. So to me, that is, I'm just going to stay safe and call it Monstera albo, so I don't get in trouble with the comments down on YouTube or on Instagram. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I did put a lot of research into this video. I hope it wasn't boring, but thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please click subscribe if you did enjoy, and we'll see you next Saturday for another video on houseplants. Have a good day.